Welcome to a special edition of Eric C. Productions. If you've watched any of my videos, you'll know that I do a lot of nostalgia type videos. Today, I'm going to tell you a short story about someone who was once as distant to me as you are watching a video about a complete stranger. This is the story of my grandfather. I didn't know my grandfather. He was never in my life. He wasn't even a memory. My uncles and aunts, his brothers and sisters, never mentioned him. One day at a family reunion, when I was 16, my two aunts were staring at me and made a comment to themselves that I looked a lot like him. And I asked myself, who's him? They just stayed quiet and they didn't say a thing. This is the story of the forgotten brother, my grandfather. My great-grandfather came to America around 1921. He was a paper son to his quote-unquote father. He met and married my great-grandmother in 1923 in San Francisco, California. My great-grandfather worked at an ice cream factory and lived in Chinatown in San Francisco. He and his wife started their family when the birth of their first child, my Aunt Elsie, was born in 1924. My grandfather, Hiram was born on March 14, 1925. My Aunt Frances was born the next year in September of 1926. They were part of the lucky few generation, the generation after the greatest generation. My great-grandparents raised their children in San Francisco during the late 1920s. I'm sure being the only son had its perks. My great-grandparents had many friends as well as family in the community. After working in the ice cream factory, my great-grandfather, Wing, went into business for himself. His adopted father had been a merchant of a dry goods store in Tucson, Arizona, and I'm sure he wanted to follow in his shoes. As he was growing up in the late 1920s and early 30s, my family, as well as many others around the United States, were affected by the Great Depression. My grandfather Hiram was named after the former California governor and former United States Senator Hiram Johnson. During the 1930s, my grandfather Hiram roamed the streets of Chinatown. One thing I know for sure was that he was an entrepreneur. He used to shine shoes for 15 cents. As I got older, I learned of his troublesome exploits as a kid. He once fell into the water in Fisherman's Wharf and had to be pulled out by a local fisherman. He once got on a bus and took a ride to Bakersfield. My grandfather was once called a free spirit, independent, and someone you might say was a little irresponsible. Hiram and his sisters welcomed a new brother, James, in 1931. His brother Alan was born in 1938. In the late 1930s, my great-grandfather moved his family down the coast to Salinas, where he opened up a store called Wings Market. My grandfather, along with his brothers and sisters, worked at the family store. Hiram was the acting store manager by the time he had turned 18. Owning a store had its perks when your father was a successful businessman. My great-grandfather loved cars, and he would buy a new one every 2 or 3 years. Hiram and his younger sister Frances were close. My aunt used to tell me that he was her favorite brother. She used to say that he was a very generous person who would give the shirt off his back to help someone out. Hiram met Sally Young when he was in San Francisco in 1944. They got married later that year in October. He was 19 and she was 15. On their marriage certificate, they changed Sally's age to 16. On October 31st, 1945, Hiram was drafted into the United States Army. By that time, World War II was over. He was assigned to the 7th Army and was an Army medic. Shortly after enlisting, Hiram and Sally welcomed their first child, Jeanette, my mother, in December of 1945. Since the war was over, my grandfather did not have to go to either the Pacific or the European theaters. He remained stateside throughout his enlistment. Hiram was enlisted in the Army until his honorable discharge in December of 1946. In January of 1947, Hiram and Sally welcomed their son, Hiram Jr., to the family. Hiram returned to civilian life and continued with his job at the family store. Even with the family, Hiram still displayed that free spirit. Secretly, he had purchased a motorcycle and parked it at a friend's house. He tried different business ventures, his father giving him $10,000 for him to open a used car dealership, which failed. Hiram, as well as his father, loved the outdoors. They would take trips to Big Sur, the Snake River, and travel the West. He also hunted as well. This photo was taken in August of 1950. Maybe my grandfather was a free spirit or independent, but one thing for sure was that he loved riding motorcycles. Maybe it was the freedom, but everything changed on that fateful day on October 16th, 1950. Details were a little sketchy, but from what I understand, he was riding a motorcycle with one of his friends on those long and winding roads in the Salinas area when he collided with a car. Hiram was thrown from his bike. Back in the 50s, wearing a helmet was unheard of, but maybe he would have survived. He suffered severe head injuries, not to mention numerous broken bones. He survived the crash, but later passed away at the hospital, according to my uncle, who was there at the hospital with his father-in-law and my great-grandfather. Hiram died of his injuries on October 16, 1950, at the age of 25. He left behind his wife, Sally, and his two children, Jeanette and Hiram Jr. He was laid to rest at the Garden of Memories in Salinas. It is the same cemetery where author John Steinbeck was laid to rest 18 years later in 1968. Perhaps there is a little irony here, for 5 years later, the actor James Dean suffered a similar fate in the same general area as my grandfather, but instead of a motorcycle, it was a car. I'd like to thank everybody who helped make this video possible. First off, I want to thank my Uncle Jim, right there, who gave me some stories about his brother. My Auntie Mitzi, who gave me more stories about her brother-in-law. Thanks to my mom, who helped me in my research for this video. And finally, I would like to thank my Aunt Frances for all of her stories and memories about my grandfather. This video is dedicated to her. Rest in peace. Hey, if you just watched my video, thanks for watching. Hit that like button and please subscribe to Eric C. Productions.